Our topic tonight is Hawking and Dawkins. Is God a delusion? And of course the reference is to Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion. His definition of delusion is a common dictionary definition: a persistent false belief held in the presence of strong contrary evidence, particularly as a symptom of psychiatric disorder. He not only regards God as a delusion, but as a pernicious, a dangerous delusion. Now that is an assertion, of course, ladies and gentlemen. How shall we check it? Because it's not made by a psychiatrist. And I am not a psychiatrist either. And in the academic world in which I work, if you go out of the area of your immediate competence, as I shall be doing this evening, the first thing to check is with the experts in the field in which you're making a pronouncement. So I did that, since I'm not a psychiatrist either. And I went to Andrew Sims, the past president of the Royal College of Psychiatry, who says this: the positive effect of belief in God is the best kept secret of contemporary society. In fact, he says, if the findings of a large series of meta-studies had gone in the other direction and shown that belief in God was damaging to well-being, it would have been on the front page of every newspaper in the world. That's what a psychiatrist says. And then he points this out. To describe belief in God as a pernicious delusion forgets there are many people who are psychiatrically disturbed, for whom their belief in God is the one thing that stabilizes their lives in a very complex universe in which they have to orientate themselves. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to make this point tonight repeatedly. This is very serious stuff. Dawkins claims to be a scientist, but he hasn't checked with the scientists in the discipline in which he's making his study. That doesn't impress many of his atheist colleagues, let alone those of us who do not share his world view. Now, of course, the idea of God as a delusion, to be placed in the category of Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy, as he does, is rather silly. Have you ever met an adult who came to believe in Santa Claus? I used to believe in Santa Claus, and then I sussed it out very quickly, but then I discovered it had certain material advantages, so I kept my discovery secret for a while. To put belief in God in the category of belief in Santa Claus is very foolish. But let's look at the serious Freudian implications behind this, because, of course, this idea goes back to Sigmund Freud, that God is simply a delusion, a wish fulfillment, a projection of our desire for a super father in a world beyond. Another famous psychiatrist, Manfred Lutz, has written a book. He's one of Germany's best-known psychiatrists, and his recent book, Eine kleine Geschichte des Größten, which unfortunately hasn't reached the English language yet, discusses this question. And what he says is this: if there is no God, then Freud gives you a brilliant argument to show that faith in God is indeed a delusion, if there is no God. But then he says, of course, if there is a God, the very same argument gives you a superb set of logic to show that atheism is a delusion. As Miłosz, as Czesław Miłosz, the Nobel laureate in literature in Poland, put it, and he had right to know, atheism is the great opium of the people, he said. The comforting thought that we shall never have to face or give account for our misdeeds, our lusts, and our crimes. And Lutz's bottom line is simple. He said, but on the question that lies behind all of this, whether there's a God or not, Freud, Jung, or Frankl cannot help you at all. And so we need to see that the argument works in both directions. Stephen Hawking said that faith in God is a fairy tale for people who are afraid of the dark. And I was asked to comment on it in the BBC, and I said, do you want a one-liner? And they said, yes. So I said, atheism is a fairy tale for people afraid of the light. You shouldn't really clap because you prove nothing by a statement like that. It simply proves, ladies and gentlemen, that these are invertible arguments. They bring nothing, so we have to go deeper in and investigate the fundamental question, is there a God or not? And then we're straight into the central problem. The idea that we must choose between God and science in the contemporary world. That is what Dawkins says, that is what Stephen Hawking and Leonard Mlodinow say in their book, The Grand Design. It's either God or science. Science is non-delusory. God is a delusion. So you have to choose, because belief in God and science are in essential and fundamental conflict. I don't believe that for a moment, and I think both history and a moment's thought show that that cannot be the case at any deep level. Let's take arguably the most famous scientific project of our generation, the Human Genome Project. Its first director was Jim Watson, an outspoken atheist, Nobel Prize winner. Its second director, Francis Collins, now the director of the National Institute of Health in the United States, a Christian. Both men at the top of the scientific tree. So it's obvious that they're not divided by science. They're divided by their worldview. So, ladies and gentlemen, I want to argue to you tonight that the real issue before us is not our science and belief in God in conflict. It's granted that there are two fundamentally opposed worldviews represented in this audience as around the world. On the one hand, there is materialism, coming up to us from the ancient Greeks, the idea, brilliant idea actually, of Democritus and Leucippus, that there were things that could not be cut, atoms, atomos, and that the universe, therefore, since there is no transcendence, is to be explained bottom up in terms of mass energy, so that the atoms, as they put it, cascading through the void, produced galaxies, produced planets, produced the earth, produced life, produced consciousness, produced the idea of God, since there isn't one. The other idea, which also was in the ancient world, was that there is transcendence. There is a God who created and sustained the universe. And various versions of that were held by Plato and Aristotle and Socrates, my intellectual hero. But it might be a mistake to begin philosophy with the ancient Greeks, because it skews the picture, because long before the ancient Greeks, the ancient Hebrews believed in a God who was utterly unique and distinct from the pagan gods, who created and sustained the universe. So the two worldviews of materialism or naturalism, which is closely related, and theism, are represented in the academy today. There is another worldview, but for the purposes of discussion, we shall not discuss pantheism this evening. Now, granted that that is the case, the real question, it seems to me, to be addressed is, where does science fit? Does science imply atheism? Or does science sit better with theism? Or is it neutral? And I shall attempt to look at that question through the lens of my interaction with Hawking's writings and with Richard Dawkins, both in his writings and in person. Is it really a delusion to believe in God? Or is it a delusion to believe in atheism? So let's have a look at some of the evidence. Granted that the conflict lies between the worldviews One of the questions we need to settle is, why is it that the conflict myth, science versus God, persists in the minds of leading scientists? And it seems to me that it persists because of a series of delusions about the nature of God and the nature of science, using the definition of delusion I have given to you. You see, when people deny God, we cannot instantly necessarily assume that they think of God in any traditional or accepted sense. And I certainly think that this is the case here. Because what I discover from Dawkins, Hawking et al. Is that they think that I believe in a God of the gaps. That is, I can't explain it, therefore God did it. Now, if you think of the ancient Greeks, some of them who thought that thunder and lightning were the god's anger, and then you do a bit of atmospheric physics at Wits University and discover it's nothing to do with the anger of the gods, but it's got to do with atmospheric pressure, electrical discharges, and so on. Exit the gods from that scene. So now but this thing you can't explain, and then science comes along and fills the gap. Now what I want you to grasp is this. If you think of God as a God of the gaps, then by definition, you have to choose between God and science, because you've defined God that way. You've actually defined your concept of God in opposition to science. So it's not surprising you then ask people to choose between God and science. But the problem is, I've never met any serious Christian, Muslim, or Jew who believes in a God of the gaps. They believe in a God who's God of the whole show, the bits we don't understand and the bits we do. So my first major point, therefore, is this. When we get into this debate, we've got to first ask, what do you mean by God? Because if we don't, we'll immediately fall into this confusion. The next problem has to do with a whole series of problems, have to do with the nature of explanation. What does it mean to explain? Now, of course, the power of science to explain at certain levels has given it rightly enormous authority in our culture, especially with the technological spin-offs that a lot of you are playing with at this very moment. Science is powerful, but unfortunately it has led to the view, and Hawking holds it and so does Dawkins, that science is essentially the only way to truth. In his book, The Grand Design, Hawking says philosophy is dead. It used to answer these great problems. But science is now the torchbearer of truth. Alas, he proceeds then to write a book on philosophy, having just said it's dead. And I'm afraid I risk saying that in his logic he proves that, at least as far as he's concerned, it is very dead. But that's another matter, and I may have time to illustrate it as we go on. But ladies and gentlemen, the notion that science is the only way to truth is logically incoherent. Because that statement, science is the only way to truth, is not a statement of science. So if it's true, it's false. It's too early in the evening for logic like that, I suspect, but there we are. It's incoherent. If only what science says is true, that statement, which is not given to us by science, cannot be true. Do you see that? And of course, Peter Medawar, the famous Nobel Prize-winning scientist, saw this point, and he says we do science a great disservice if we think it can answer every question, when it's so obvious that science cannot answer the simple questions of a child. Where do I come from? Where am I going? What is the meaning of my life? His book, Advice to a Young Scientist, is highly recommendable. This notion of scientism is false. And of course it's false, and you believe it's false. Otherwise, half your faculties at this university would have to close overnight. Because if science is the only way to truth, we don't need literature, we don't need languages, we don't need history, we don't need economics, we don't need all these other fields. There's a related problem that many young people today are being taught that not only is science the only way to truth, it's coextensive with rationality. Now that's false for the same reason that I've given. But we need to carefully distinguish these things. So moving on from that, let's look a little bit at the notion of explanation. Science explains, but in what sense and at what level? And this is another reason why the new atheists pitch science against God. Because they're thinking of science and God as explanations. And they say you have to choose. Well, I go into a number of schools, and I did in South Africa here a delightful time with 400 or 500 boys. And I put it to them, suppose we have a Ford motor car here, and you can see its engine, and I say, I'm going to offer you two kinds of explanation for this Ford motor car engine. One is in terms of law and mechanism, the law of internal combustion and mechanical engineering. The other is Henry Ford. Please choose. I'm glad you're laughing. Why is it that some of our leading thinkers cannot see that distinction between an explanation in terms of law and mechanism and an explanation in terms of agency? And notice something else. Henry Ford, as an explanation, as the agent who designed the car, doesn't compete with the scientific explanation. He complements the scientific explanation. Now, Isaac Newton, when he discovered his law of gravitation, had the sense to see that. And so when he discovered it, he didn't say, marvelous, now I know how the universe works, I don't need God. What he actually did do was write Principia Mathematica, the most brilliant book in the history of science, saying explicitly that he hoped it would lead to the thinking person believing in God. Because he distinguished, so easy to do, between mechanism and law on the one hand and agency on the other. Let me put that another way. The existence of a mechanism or a law that describes or does something is not an argument against the non-existence of a God that designed the whole show. Because in terms of explanation, God and science belong to different categories. So they don't compete, nor do they conflict. And of course, the interesting thing is this, ladies and gentlemen. Science, with Newton and Kepler and Galileo before him, and Clerk Maxwell and Babbage after him, exploded in the 16th and 17th centuries AD. And it's interesting, so interesting that it happened when it did and where it did, in a Europe that was characterized by the worldview of Christianity. And scholars with whom I have worked, like John Hedley Brooke, the first professor of science and religion at Oxford, and Peter Harrison, his successor, will argue something that's sometimes called Whitehead's thesis, sometimes called Merton's thesis, that, well, as Whitehead put it, Europe in 1500 knew less than Aristotle in 200 BC. And yet by 1700, the Principia Mathematica had been written by Newton. And he asks the question, why? And he puts it down to belief in the rationality of the Creator God. That's what Melvin Calvin, Nobel Prize winner for biochemistry, said. That as he looks to discover the origin of that conviction, that it's worth doing science, that there are laws out there, he discovers it in an idea which he says was discovered by the ancient Hebrews, that there is a Creator God. Ladies and gentlemen, C.S. Lewis, as usual, pithily formulated it this way. And became scientific. Why? Because they expected law in nature. They expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. I'm not remotely ashamed of being a scientist and a Christian, you know, because Christianity arguably gave me the subject. Now, the irony of this is that if in the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries, belief in God was the motor that drove science, what is happening today raises some very interesting and deep questions. So history is rather important in this direction, and it's not simply a straw in the wind, because if you argue, as Dawkins did with me, but all the people believed in God then, so what would you expect? There is an outside. There is Chinese history of science, studied by Joseph Linder in Oxford, brilliant chemist and sinologist, author of the authoritative treatises on the history of science in China. And being a new Marxist, he spent many years trying to explain the lack of abstract scientific development in China. They had, of course, a lot of technology, fireworks, printing, and so on. But why they didn't develop abstract science? And in the end, he came to this conclusion. He said, I can only put it down to the fact that the Chinese did not have the unifying concept of a single creator who had created the universe according to rational laws. So both sides are historical evidence that there's a very close relationship between our fascination for science and belief in God. That, of course, doesn't surprise me, because if you ask what is the essence of science, it is taxonomy. If we went around all the disciplines represented in this room, you would know words that I don't know, and I know a whole lot of words you don't know. Talking about the innards of galaxies and dark matter and coal dust in space and all this kind of thing. Taxonomy, where did that start? It started on the second page of the Bible, where God commanded human beings to name the animals. He didn't do it himself. He started taxonomy. This is a fascinating world. Go for it. And that is a wonderful motivation to go for it. So it seems to me that one has nothing to be ashamed of in this particular direction. But this matter of explanation needs to be gone into a little bit more deeply. I said earlier, science explains, but in what sense? If I say to you there's a law of gravitation, does that explain gravity? I wish they had taught me at school that it didn't, and that Newton realized that it didn't. Nobody knows what gravity is. The law of gravitation enables you to do calculations of the acceleration of heavy bodies towards each other. It doesn't tell you what gravity is. And the philosopher Wittgenstein said very perceptively that the great deception of modernism is that the laws of nature are explanations of the phenomena of nature when they're not. They are descriptions, and they have predictive power, and they are enormously important, but they don't tell you what energy is. No one knows. What gravity is, no one knows. So even when we say science explains, it's rather foolish and like that to pit God against it when we are so limited in our knowledge. A dose of humility is a very good thing for all of us. And because of this, there's a lot of confusion about these laws. Hawking, in his book, its central assertion is this: because there is a law of gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. When I read that, I thought, come again? Because there is a law of gravity, because there is something, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. That's absurd. But wait a minute, because there is a law of gravity, he doesn't say because there is gravity. Because there is a law of gravity. But what does a law mean if it has nothing to describe? And now you come to the fascinating notion that is held by many people, including Paul Davis and Peter Atkins, that the laws create something. I'll come to that in a moment. Let's keep with this sentence. If logic doesn't disturb you too much, I love it, but I'm a pure mathematician, you say. Because there is a law of gravity, the universe can and will create itself. Let's have a look at that statement. If I say X creates Y, what does the word mean? They mean that I've assumed the existence of X to explain the existence of Y. So if I say X creates X, I'm assuming the existence of X to explain the existence of X. And what does that show? It shows that nonsense remains nonsense, even if high-powered scientists talk it. So there are two levels of self-contradiction in a single sentence, but it's worse than that. The law of gravity being created. That is a profound misunderstanding. And I'm amazed, frankly, because Stephen Hawking was at Cambridge a bit ahead of me. He's light years ahead of me in his scientific ability. But this is not science. This is deductions from it. Just think of what has been said. You don't need God, basically, because a law will do it. Oh, I wish it did. Peter Atkins, the Oxford professor of physical chemistry, and I have had one or two very interesting encounters. There is a thing on the web called Dueling Professors, and it's him and me. And I said to Peter once, I said, Peter, tell me, what do you think created the universe? And he said, mathematics. So I started to laugh, and he said, why are you laughing? He was quite put out. Well, I said, Peter, sorry, I'm a mathematician. That must be the most absurd thing I've ever heard. He said, why? I said, tell me this, 1 + 1 = 2. Has that ever put £2 in your pocket? I suspect that our financial crisis came about because people believed it could. You've heard of creative accounting. And C.S. Lewis made the point years ago, and he said, you'll do arithmetic from now to eternity, but it'll never put any money in your bank. Because the laws of nature are of the form if A then B, but you've got to catch A first or you'll never get B. And he writes some very profound things in his book on miracles that I have not time to do this evening. So then, we have 3 levels of self-contradiction in a sentence that forms the heart of an argument by Stephen Hawking. It's the main thesis of the book. I find that extremely disturbing. I've tried subsequently to create my own sentence with 3 levels of self-contradiction. I can't do it. But maybe you can accept this challenge. Law doesn't even cause anything. Newton's laws of motion have never moved a snooker ball in the history of the universe. People with keys do that. And oddly enough, the first example of a law that occurs in Hawking's book is the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. Well, wonderful, but that doesn't create either the sun or the world. These are very elementary things, it seems, but because they're in philosophy and philosophy is dead, one doesn't quite understand them. But now, the reaction to all of this from many leading scientists, and I faced it in public from most of the new atheists, is, look, there's no point in introducing God at any level. Because if you introduce God and say God created the universe, well, of course, you've got to ask the question, who created God, logically? And then who created the God that created the God that created the God that created the God? And since you can't go back forever, that's absurd, so let's go and play football. But just half a minute. This is one of Dawkins' main arguments in the God delusion. God is a delusion because of this sequence going backwards in time, but let's analyze it again. I'm so delighted I used to go and listen to Lewis expound English and the logic of the way it works. So let's look at this. That who created X? What does that question mean? What are the assumptions that are hidden in it? Well, one big one is that X is created. You cannot ask who created X unless you assume that X is created. So if you say who created God, you're assuming immediately that God is created, but what if he isn't? Again, I've never met a Jew, Christian or Muslim who believed that God was created. So the question is irrelevant in that sense and doesn't deal with the fundamental issue. Is there an eternal, uncreated God? Now, there's a lot more to it, but when Dawkins faced me with that, I said, well, the question, of course, is not valid for an uncreated God. and I didn't say this to him, but I've said it subsequently, if he'd written a book called The Created God's Delusion, I wouldn't have bought it, because I don't need him to tell me created gods are a delusion. Freud taught us that. We usually call them idols. But anyway, let's go back to the thing. He believes it's a valid question, so I said to Richard, let me try it on you. You believe that the universe created you. It is your creator. So let me ask you a question. Who created your creator? Still waiting for the answer. These questions work in more directions than one. Now, there's more to be said. The philosophers among you will say, well, this is a distorted version of the cosmological argument. Of course it is. But I leave that for you to investigate yourselves tonight, if you can't sleep. Now, what shall we come to next? Well, another delusion, a persistent false belief among the new atheists, this is enormously important. It's a false understanding of the nature of faith. You may not have noticed, but the new atheists have redefined faith. Dawkins regards it as a pernicious delusion because it means for him belief without evidence. When I debated Peter Singer in Melbourne, I had told the audience very honestly, as I now tell you, that my parents were Christian. They weren't sectarian, which was very unusual in Northern Ireland, and even more unusual, they let me think. And I told the audience this, so Hitchens got up and said, of course, my big objection to religion is just this, that people remain in the faith in which they were brought up. And I was a prime example, of course. So when I got a chance to speak, I said, Peter, I'm sure the audience would be very interested to know about your background. Tell me, were your parents atheists? Yes, he said they were. Oh, I said, so you remained in the faith in which you were brought up? Oh, but he said, it isn't a faith. Oh, I said, sorry, Peter, I thought you believed it. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this is one of the world's top philosophers. And Twitter space went alive from people asking what on earth is going on that a leading philosopher doesn't recognize his worldview as a belief system. I was stunned, I must say. But you see, it comes from a redefinition of faith. When Dawkins meets me, he calls me a man of faith. That's not a compliment, it's an insult. Because what he means is Lennox believes where he knows there's no evidence. And that definition has so buried itself in the psyche that it's now an official definition of Webster's online dictionary. Faith, noun, belief where there's no evidence. When the word faith comes from the Latin fides, which in the OED is loyalty, trust. And all of us know, alas, what evidence-based faith is. We thought we could trust the bank. We discovered it wasn't evidence-based. The markets froze because they couldn't gain the evidence, the basis for trust. We all understand that. And to redefine faith as belief where there's no evidence is doubly dangerous. Blind faith, of course, is dangerous. And we better bring that adjective back. And of course, I have to ask, as a Christian, other faiths must talk for themselves, is the Christian faith a blind faith? Well, no. And an easy way to show it is just to cite to you one of the central statements of the Apostle John, where he said, he'd written a book, and he said many other signs Jesus did in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written that you might believe that Jesus is Hamashiach, the Messiah, the Son of God, and that believing you might have life in his name. Here's the evidence, I've written it down. So he understands Christianity to be an evidence-based faith, not a proof-based faith. Proof is a word that has a rigorous meaning in mathematics. Everywhere else it's informal. Evidence beyond reasonable doubt. I've been married to the same lady for 44 years. I couldn't prove to you mathematically that she loves me. E to the I pi plus 1 equals 0, therefore Sally loves me. No. but I tell you, I'd stake my life on it. The fact that we don't have mathematical proof doesn't mean we haven't proof big enough to stake our lives on it. But it brings me to another relevant point. God, ladies and gentlemen, is not a theory, he's a person. And trust in a person depends on evidence of many kinds, not simply rational scientific argument, but also experience, history, trajectory, all of these different things. So it's evidence I talk about, not proof in that rigorous mathematical sense which you only get in mathematics and nowhere else. So what I'm saying is this, that the new atheist definition of faith is a persistent false belief in the face of strong contrary evidence. It is a delusion. But it's a dangerous delusion. It's pernicious because it conceals the fact that science involves faith at its core every day. Einstein was clever enough to see it, but then he was quite bright, wasn't he? He said, I cannot imagine a scientist without this faith. What faith? The faith in the rational intelligibility of the universe, that science can be done. That's what stimulated science in the early days. They believed it could be done because they believed in a rational creator. Every scientist, whether they believe in God or not, has to believe that science can be done, has to believe that there is order. Now, what's the warrant for that? I was taught quantum physics by Professor Sir John Polkinghorne, and in his many books he points this out so clearly. He said physics is powerless to explain its belief in the rational intelligibility of the universe, because you've got to believe that before you do any physics at all. Now this begins to be very interesting. Now that we see that faith is intimately involved in everyday life and in science, we ask the next step, what is its warrant? Now the fun starts. I talked to my atheist friends and I said, tell me about the mind that does science. What is it? Well, they say it's the brain. And what's the brain? Well, actually it's the end product of a mindless, unguided process that didn't have it in mind. Oh, I see. Now, let me put it to you, ladies and gentlemen. If you knew that the computer you use was the end product of a mindless, unguided process, would you trust it? Of course not. That idea, oddly enough, goes back to Darwin, who worried about the reliability of human cognitive processes because they were descended in the way he believed they were, from much simpler down to the primitive animals with no apparent brain at all. Now this is a very interesting thing, because now we're beginning to see, as Polkinghorne points out, that if you are a physicalist, as Dawkins is, that is, everything can be reduced to physics and chemistry, you've got to believe that in the end the thoughts in your mind are just the firing of synapses in the brain. But as John Polkinghorne again points out, that is to trash all possibility of meaning. And there are many leading philosophers today beginning to catch on. How's this for a book title? Appeared the last couple of months by a leading American philosopher, Thomas Nagel. Mind and Cosmos. Why the neo-Darwinian view of the universe is almost certainly false. He's an atheist. And the point he's making is, reductionist science has been brilliantly successful because we have left out the very thing that's doing the science, the mind. And in his book he argues that naturalism and physicalism cannot cope with the mind and are in danger of implosion. Why? Because we're in the digital age, ladies and gentlemen. We've discovered information, and we've discovered it, a large amount of it, in every one of the 10 trillion cells of our body, called the DNA code with which I started this lecture. And oddly, information is not physical. It is not material. Its carriers are material, but information isn't. So now we have the magnificent irony that materialist scientists have discovered that non-material things lie at the heart of the most complex systems known to human beings, that is life. So what are we going to do with it? Asked Nagel, asked Alvin Plantinga, asked a whole host of contemporary scientists in the modern world. Now this gets very close home to my field of mathematics. It doesn't get completely there, but it gets close enough. Because you see, if you turn all this over into theoretical computer science, and if you're not interested in that, just go to sleep for 2 minutes. The cell is an information processor. Therefore, according to the Church Turing thesis, it can be simulated by a Turing machine. Now, there are various results about Turing machines, and one of them is this, that they can process information, but they cannot create it. That is fascinating, because it now raises the question of the origin of digital information. I'm not going to go into, you can wake up now. I'm not going to go into this detail. I'm going to tell you a story that illustrates what the issue is, though. In my college at Oxford, we have delightful candlelit dinners. I wish I could invite you all to one of them, but we haven't enough space. We've got quite a few South Africans actually there, who are my friends. But anyway, on our special nights, the guests are placed according to some higher power, intelligently designed in some way, and I find myself beside a world-class biochemist. And in Oxford, people tend not to ask you who you are, they ask you what you do. And he said, what do you do? And I said, I'm a pure mathematician. Oh, he said, how desperately boring. And he meant it. So I backtracked and I said, oh, it can't be as boring as all that, because you see, I'm interested in the big questions. He said, what big questions? Well, I said, for instance, the status of the universe. Is it created or not? And the status of human life. Is it made in the image of God or not? He said, don't go on anymore. It's worse than I thought. The bottom line is, I'm an atheist, I'm a reductionist, we've nothing to talk about, we're going to have a totally miserable evening. That's a good start for a dinner party. So I said to him, no, we're not. I said, yes, take this reductionism. I said, I know 3 different kinds of reductionism. Which kind are you? And that was a bit difficult, so I made it easier. And I said, I'm a methodological reductionist myself. I split a big problem into little problems, solve the little problems, and hope it gives me insight in the big problems. He said, I do that too in my lab. Well, I said, good, then we can talk about that, can't we? But I said, you know, I think you're an ontological reductionist. Everything can be reduced to physics and chemistry. Like Dawkins says, I want to reduce elephants to physics and chemistry. Well, okay. So he said, that's right, that's exactly what I believe. So I said, do you mind if we do an experiment? He said, what, here? Yes, I said, this is Oxford, why not? So I picked up the menu. It wasn't terribly imaginative, it said roast chicken in English. And he said, what's the problem? Well, I said, look at this, R-O-A-S-T. Explain to me the semiotics of those marks in terms of the physics and chemistry of the paper and ink. There was a little silence, and his wife was sitting beside him, and rather unkindly she said, get out of that if you can. But you know, I admire him for this. He didn't try. He said this. He said, John, for 40 years I've gone into my laboratory thinking that could be done. I was stunned. He said, it can't be done. I said, why not? He said, it's not within the explanatory power of physics and chemistry to cope with semiotics. I said, what, you mean you need an input of information? He said, exactly. Now notice please, this is not information of the gaps. It's the nature of the thing being studied that demands an intelligent input. And then it dawned on him that I wasn't bright enough to have thought of that answer. He said, where did you get that? Oh, I said, it's okay. I got it from a Nobel Prize winner. Roger Sperry, Nobel Prize for Medicine. It's interesting, ladies and gentlemen, isn't it? R-O-A-S-T. But now let's do some magic. And we look through a magic stereoscopic microscope that exists somewhere in Narnia, And we see a double helix unfolding, and we see it spitting off letters AACGTTAAGCTGAATG. And of course, coming from Ireland, I haven't a clue what it means. So with big Irish eyes, I look at it and say, what is that? And the molecular biologist says it's the human genome. But those letters, you can see it's a magic microscope. Those letters, what are they? Well, they're codons, they're letters in the chemical alphabet. Oh, I said, is there meaning to this? Yes, because it codes for something. It codes for the proteins. Oh, fascinating. How many of forever? How many of those letters are there? 3.5 billion roughly. Oh, I see. That's very interesting. What is the origin of all that? Chance of necessity, she said. You saw the letters ROAST, and you inferred intelligence because they had a semiotic dimension. All sorts of physical processes went into producing that menu. But the moment you looked at it and perceived that semiotic dimension, you deduced upwards, not downwards, to chance and necessity. You deduced upwards to an intelligent input. How is it, ladies and gentlemen? I throw this in Oxford Common Rooms if it's getting boring. How is it that we can look at the longest word that's ever been discovered and ascribe it to natural, unguided processes? There are many natural processes involved in it, I have no doubt. But to ascribe it only to those strikes me as a bit of spectacular doublethink. Ladies and gentlemen, I close with this. There are two worldviews, as I said. The one says in the beginning were the particles, and the particles formed the galaxies, and the galaxies formed the universe, and the universe formed the planets, and the world, and life, and information. The other worldview goes like this. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things came to be through Him, and without Him nothing came to be that came to be. The worldviews are diametrically opposed. The one starts with mass energy, and information, word, and all those related concepts are derivative. The other starts with the word, and mass energy is derivative. Oh, but you say that's not an explanation at all. And this is my last word. As Richard Dawkins puts it, if you bring God in to explain anything, you're explaining it by something that's more complex than it is itself. So it's no explanation. And I say, oh, that's very interesting. I've just come across a book called The God Delusion. It's 450 pages, it's quite complex. So I asked about the words in this thing. String them together to form one long word. Okay, ask about the origin of that word. And I discovered the origin of that word, lots of mechanical processes, physical processes to produce the book, but the origin of the word is in the infinitely more complex mind of Richard Dawkins, so of course I dismiss that as an explanation and look for a naturalistic one. Ladies and gentlemen, where have we got the idea that all explanation moves from the simple to the complex? If you are a naturalist, you've got to believe that because there's no alternative. But for me as a Christian, there are much more options. And I don't believe that. And ladies and gentlemen, the complete irony of the situation is this. My greatest objection to atheism is not because I believe in God. It's because atheism, reducing everything to physics and chemistry, squeezes meaning out of the world and science and rationality and the concept of truth. That's got nothing to do with God. Whereas the Christian worldview tells me that the reason we can do science is very simple. It's because the same God who created the universe out there is ultimately responsible for the mind in here. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, very much.